is your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Heinnes.
Hello everybody, welcome to Books in Hindsight. I'm your host, author Matthew Heinnes. Now today I want to remind everybody that it is the Christmas season, so be nice to everybody and be of good cheer and forgive people when they trespass against you, as Jesus would have you do. Now we're going to be talking about that in our big story today, but the really big story is the Books in Hindsight. Let me say that again. The Books in Hindsight blog. It's almost a mouthful like the blah 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 blog, but the Books in Hindsight blog is now fully in operation, and our first actually it was our second entry. The first one was about our 1 million books in 1 year challenge that we're going to be undertaking in 2021. The second blog was about my first podcast guest that I was going to have on to talk about how you sell 1 million books in 1 year. Unfortunately, things didn't go as we planned, and we're going to be going into the story about 3 things when a podcast guest cancels. So let's get into that right now. Remember to comment if you've had an experience like this. If you have any advice, please subscribe and join the Books in Hindsight family. If you're an author or publisher or somebody who has some savvy inside tips for publishing and for young authors, especially independent ones, we want you on the podcast. So with that, let's get into the story. 3 things when a podcast guest cancels. Over a week ago, I had a wonderful guest scheduled for Books in Hindsight to discuss how I was going to sell 1 million books in the next year. What happened is what can happen to any podcast host, and in this short and easy to follow blog, I will tell you 3 things you can do when that happens. It was all going great until right at the very last minute. Well, actually there were 5 or 6 hours until the podcast, but I had to set up my lights and write my script. The fact is, I've been working furiously for months, getting ready for the 1 million books in 1 year challenge. I have been editing, reformatting, and republishing 6 books across Amazon, Kobo, iTunes, and soon Heinessight books will be on Ingram Spark. In order to increase my Heinessight brand awareness, I started designing my own line of Heinessight apparel. I have designs ranging from political to religious, and all of them unique designs thought up and designed by me, and a lot of help from Canva. In order to pre-kick off the event, I needed to invite a guest on Books in Hindsight who could give me and my listeners and viewers advice on how to sell 1 million books. Of course, I would be asking them to cite their experiences. I want my listeners to glean as much information about how to turn their works into sales as possible. I needed someone who either helped to get books on the market or someone who had been through the process. I think my first mistake was to go through a spam email I get occasionally. If daily qualifies as occasionally. Since it says podcast guests in the subject line, I thought that it was a gift from heaven or a sign of destiny, depending upon your disposition. I scrolled through until I found what I was looking for, an author and comedian who did public performances. Of course, it didn't hurt much that she was attractive and would make a nice thumbnail for my podcast and YouTube. I sent off an inquiry immediately, hoping to hear a response in a few days. You can guess my surprise when I had a response within a few minutes. I was probably so surprised that I didn't see the warning signs, but in hindsight, they were there. "Who is this? How did you get my name?" was the response. I texted her back and explained I wanted her to be a guest on my podcast. I preempted her next question with Books in Hindsight to talk about how to sell 1 million books in 1 year. We then went back and forth for a few minutes when I finally suggested we speak on the phone. We spoke for almost 20 minutes, and everything seemed to be coming up clover for Books in Hindsight. She was hilarious, she was smart, and she had a great voice. I explained to her that I was just a small podcast trying to get back on its feet after a year's absence, a political campaign, and another podcast I started about aliens, Bigfoot, and Dogman called Encounters USA. Encounters USA really piqued her interest, and she even offered to have me on her podcast with her and her son in the future. Things were going swimmingly. With a guest like her starting off the 1 million books in 1 year challenge, what could go wrong? We booked a date for Friday evening, 7 p.m. Central Time. I then had a chance to go over her website and see what kind of comedian she was and what kind of book she wrote. Let's just say I was impressed. She was hilarious. It was going to be a great podcast, and with her good looks, I was bound to bring on the viewers and subscribers. It was really exciting. An author, a comedian, and someone who shared my penchant for dry wit and puns. Friday morning, day of podcast, I received the text message no podcaster wants to get. What time is the podcast? The reason no podcaster wants to hear that question is it leaves it open for the guest to actually know the time of the event that is going to keep them from doing your podcast. When I repeated the time by text, she explained there was a family issue that had to be dealt with, and could we do it an hour later? And so it went on and on through trying to reschedule for later, and then the next day. Each attempt leading more and more to me getting the Jeffrey Dahmer treatment. In other words, every time I proposed an alternative, I got the cold shoulder. I finally gave in and suggested she try contacting me in April, and I would see if I had any openings then. And so we come to the point of what are 3 things we can do when the podcast guest cancels. Option 1. A lot goes into making a podcast. Just the prep work involved includes writing scripts, doing promotions on social media and other outlets. The promotion themselves involve hours of designing thumbnails for podcasts and videos that will attract attention and excite interest in the podcast. When someone cancels, it's like they just stole hours of your life you will never see again. Some podcast hosts recommend sure and swift retaliation for this kind of impromptu absence from their podcast. A general consensus of podcast hosts provides a list of common retaliations meted out to guests for canceling at the last minute. You'll never work in this town again. A classic retaliation used by media moguls to force Hollywood stars to put out or get up, or was that put up or get in? Either way, the sheer number of podcasts and the volunteer status of guests limit its effectiveness. Dead horse head in bed. Although still effective, the continued use of it and domestic servants since The Godfather came out in the 1970s has created a desensitizing effect and is more often taken as a practical joke than a form of Umberto. Unwanted magazine subscriptions. A truant podcast guest will definitely think twice about canceling on your podcast when he or she finds themselves explaining the latest edition of Gay Asian Porn Magazine out of Hunglo, China in the Family Mail. Option 2. Turn the other cheek. Around holiday time, there is no better time to just forgive and forget. Your podcast guest really may have had an issue and not just found your little podcast not worth the return on their time or investment, as you and everyone who has listened to your podcast might be inclined to think. Option 3. Somewhere in between. Although I myself subscribe to Jesus' admonition to forgive others their trespasses so that Jesus will forgive mine, it's my first inclination to always believe the word of any guest who fails to keep a podcast appointment. Since there's only been one, my faith has not really been tested. Still, I cannot resist the temptation to resort to option 1, while keeping the spirit of option 2 alive. So, I have left open the option of my canceled guest returning in April. April 1st, that is. Well, there you have it. What would you do in that situation? Leave a comment. Let me know. Am I wrong? Am I right? Are you a podcast guest? Are you a podcast host? What do you do? What is the right thing to do? So leave a comment, and please don't forget, I'm a conservative politician in Washington State. That means Google, they want to shadow ban and keep everybody who is a conservative, pro-American politician from ever being even seen by anybody. So hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and share this video. Now you're going to see a lot more Books in Hindsight blogs in the future. So just remember what we always say on Books in Hindsight. Keep on reading. Happy New Year, everybody.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Heines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to theheinessight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Heines and other great authors.